Alright guys, what's going on? So, as you can tell, I'm still pretty sick, but I'm gonna push through it anyway and do this because I don't know what else to do. This is just something that I really enjoy doing and that I'm passionate about. So just gotta make it happen either way. But on a little bit of a side note, that your health is very important. As they say, health is wealth. And I was kind of thinking about, sometimes when people get sick, how they push themselves a little bit too far. And my whole thinking was with that, as far as taking it easy when you're sick, is would you take a day off if it meant that you could live for another week? It's kind of similar to investing, whereas, would you put $50 into something if you knew you could get $300 back? But that's a whole nother story. Today I'm talking about part one for Born a Crime. It's by Trevor Noah, he's a comedian, but now he's on the Daily Show, or he's the host of the Daily Show. And I really liked his book. I definitely recommend it. It's about him growing up in South Africa towards the end of apartheid. And what's interesting about it is not only it gives you a historical context, but it gives you kind of a first-person view of what happened there. And so basically, the idea behind Born a Crime is there's a law. They had a law passed there in I think it was like 1920 or 1950s, something like that. They passed a law that made it a crime for the Europeans to have make babies with the natives there. Another term is they used the term cardinal or carinal, and I believe it's basically a law against miscegenation. And we also had we also in America we had similar laws too, which banned interracial marriages. But basically, if you got caught, having a baby having a mixed baby, the native was subjected to a possible 5 years in prison, and the European was subjected to about 4 years in prison. But as far as like just having sex, what would happen was if you were caught, the native would be beaten and thrown in jail, whereas the European would just be given a stern warning. But I got some notes on the book of what I want to talk about. What made like a real connection for me with the book was that I found a lot of it was pretty easy for me to relate to him. One of the similarities that we share is we both like to read books. His mom kind of bought him, she really invested in him and would get him encyclopedias, have him reading the Bible, and all different types of stuff. I didn't really get into reading too much when I was younger, but I didn't really start until more recently. When I was about almost 21, I started getting more back into reading a lot. But for me, my first books were Harry Potter, the Harry Potter series. And then after that, I read all of the series of unfortunate events. But now, I'm not so much into that kind of stuff. It's still good. I still would recommend reading it. But I'm more into like just famous like novels, literary stuff, anything that really adds to my thinking, and also nonfiction as well. Another similarity that we have is being exposed to different cultures. So because he had a black mother who was I think she was I believe she was Hosa, and her mother was Hosa, and then his father was from Switzerland, and he had like a lot of German friends as well. So growing up, he got exposed to her, and then his father had an influence, so he learned German. But because of because of his family and apartheid, he learned English, he learned German, he learned Zulu. He also learned Zulu, Xhosa. Was it Swanta or Swanana? I think it was. And because of his family, he ended up learning all these different African languages. Oh, and African, which was the language of from the Dutch settlers that mixed with the natives. Let me see. And then some other stuff too was that when he was in. Another thing that was interesting was, again, him growing up in different neighborhoods, or with moving around with his family. He was subjected to like different neighborhoods, and for instance, one of them was backstory. That's how they set it up. So they would have the white people would be in one section, the colored people would be in another section, and then you would have blacks in another section, and then Indians in another section. So they really, they were in the big difference between, even though they learned a lot of their techniques from how America was set up, it was basically, they did it, but they made it law. They institutionalized it. There wasn't any sort of, I think that's racist, or I think, this is a racist law, or this is that. No, it was straight black and white. It was literally just black and white. Did straight race, just direct racism, and what is it? It was straight racism, and they had all these different all these different places, and one of them places he grew up with was like his mother's side, which was black. In the black neighborhood, he had to stay in the house. Or he could only play in the backyard and stuff. He couldn't go outside because at the time, if you got caught in it would be a crime for him to be there. So if he got caught, the police would take him away and they would put him into an orphanage. And this developed again another similarity that we have, which was he basically spent a lot of time by himself. And so he would just kind of just live in his own world and entertain himself. And that's what I do a lot, especially at work. I'll be now I'm in my own section. I'm loading a truck, so I'm way in the back of the truck by myself, loading packages, nobody else in there, nobody else around. I barely see anybody except for the supervisors, and I'll just sit in there and read and I have conversations with myself and pretend I'm, it's kind of similar to this, where I'll just stand, I'm standing in front of a group of people giving a speech and just practicing on learning my voice and just imagining all these different things and plotting stuff out. And another, with the cultures, is that with his languages, he was able to have a diverse group of friends. I talked about how when he was at school, he tested into this, or he had to take a test before he got into the school, and he did really well on the test, so they put him in the A classes, and he went to the A class, and it was all a bunch of white kids except for a couple black kids and an Indian kid. And he kind of thought that was weird. And then he went to when he went to recess though, it was all black people. And then the group of people that he saw in the white kids he saw in his class would go over there, and then all the black kids would be, playing by themselves. Very similar to how America is set up. Very similar to how America is set up, where you can live, and I see it it's like every single city I have ever been to, it's always the same. You can kind of divide the city down in a line of most of the black people live in the poorer section, most of the rich people, or most of the white people live in the rich section. And it was in this divide, it was the same way. Even though they went to the same school, it was like they lived completely different lives. And he was like all kind of by himself, and being black and white, it's one of those things growing up where there's a certain point, like especially in America, where you have to decide, are you going to hang out with the black people, or are you going to hang out with the white people? You can't really have it, get it both ways, because again, a common thing there too is, even though there's a lot of racism, people didn't necessarily address it. Either you were black, you were white, but you were people accepted you as a person. And he talked about how difficult that was, because how difficult it can be that you can't really switch back and forth, because it's easier. He was saying like it's easier, or especially like where you live, because it's easier to be an outsider and become an insider than it is to be an insider and be an outsider. I think it's easier to be an outsider or be inside, or from being an insider from the outside than it is to be an outsider from the inside. It's a little bit confusing, but like he did explain what I started to take it as was, it's easier to be a white person and be accepted by black culture than it is to be a white person and hang around with black people but still live in a white culture, because then you're like a traitor, as opposed to just being straight up accepted. I was being accepted, and I also embraced that too. I can relate to that too, because again, I generally hang out with black people. I relate more to black people. However, because of my skin color, I can at least blend in with white people. Like for instance, I like to go to a lot of different events, and one of them I went to was the Kentucky Farm Bureau, which is very Republican, and which a lot of people say, oh, you're a traitor, that's bad, and I went there I was protesting with the fairness campaign, the LGBTQ group, against the Farm Bureau, because they have a lot of discriminatory bylaws in their, I guess you could call it a constitution, and also like discriminatory against like the death penalty, minorities, unionizing, and like traditional marriages. And I protested, and one of the things was a couple of people got tickets to go inside so they could go inside and protest. And so they protested because they had a big mannequin, or this big, paper mache thing, this character, Freddie Farm Bureau, or no, Tina, or I can't remember what the name of it was, but it was a contrast to Freddie Farm Bureau, their mascot. And so they got kicked. They were asked to leave, but they still had the tickets, and I'm a hungry person. So I was the only one. I took one of the tickets, went inside, ate, and got to listen to what they, learned a little bit about, their thoughts and all that kind of stuff, and just to get a general vibe. And I'm just a learner, so I like to get a little bit of everything. Another one was eating a lot. I used to work at a produce distributor place, and like one of the people that I worked with there was like, hey, like I know you're just starting off, but like once you've been here for a little while, you can kind of like take little bits of the food and stuff like that, and the guy, the owner, he won't mind too much. And I'm like, oh, okay, which ended up being like a pretty which ended up being a mistake on their part, because like if they had little snacks like some donuts or bagels, I was going in on those. Anything that was kind of packed sparsely to where you could take some out and without, you couldn't tell the difference. I was eating grape tomatoes, Roma tomatoes, grapes, what else? Avocados, pretty much anything I could get, anything that I could get my hands on. Another one, another one was, questioning authority. So he was at the Christian church. He went to a missionary school, and he questioned a lot of the laws. Like, for instance, why, if I want, not being able to drink the grape juice and eat the crustian, I think it's called, the crackers. They're supposed to be the body of Christ and then the blood of Christ. And he was like, he's like, only the Catholic kids are allowed to eat it. Well, he got sick of that. He didn't think he should abide by that, so he got sick of that. He and he snuck in there, and he drank the whole bottle of juice, and he ate all the crackers, and he got in big trouble for that. And he was like, well, why should I be, denied, or like denied Jesus, or denied, why should I should be denied, food and stuff like that. And another example was, he said, well, wasn't Jesus a Jew? And he's like, yeah. So you're telling me if Jesus came in here, you wouldn't let him drink his blood, like drink his blood or eat from his body? And they were like, And I have that same thing where I question laws, and if I think that's unjust, then I'm going to do everything that I can to break that law and to avoid getting caught. Let's see, another one. Another one too that I thought was cool was about, and another contrast to the Farm Bureau was, I also went to the All Black National Convention, so they're kind of like polar opposites. But of course, I enjoyed the National Convention much, much more. Which brings me to the next point of growing up there. He learned, even though it was very poor, especially compared to here, he actually got was able to gain a better knowledge of wealth building. He was able to gain a better knowledge of what wealth was and what economics were, as opposed to here, where it's kind of like there's a system, and you have to, it's basically you're taught to go into it, and whatever happens to you, whatever you get out of the system, that's what you get out of the system. So kind of basically with black people, forcing them into the system, they have to deal with racist employees, tax laws, all these other things that are basically put in place to keep them down. Well, here, it's much more difficult, but yet you learn the basics. Like, basically, people had to be more self-reliant. So a lot of people, like, for instance, houses, you slowly, kind of like investing, you slowly built up a house. So you'd start with a shanty of just kind of pieces of metal and a roof and stuff like that. And then you'd save up some money, you'd get a brick wall, save up some more, you get another brick wall, and another brick wall, and another brick wall. All of a sudden you got a room now. And then you would, put a divide in there, and then you would get another room. And sometimes you would build like shacks and stuff in the back, and adding on and adding on. And over time, you'd build up like a pretty nice house. And then also, because people were poor, people couldn't afford, full price stuff, you would have people would set up shop, and they would sell, you would be able to buy, whatever you needed. So for what you were making that day. So you could buy a cup of sugar, 2 eggs, maybe a couple pounds of flour, and stuff like that. And then people also started their own bars. So you'd have somebody in the back, you know, they would put some lawn chairs, play some music, and then the guys would go there and drink and, you know, converse with one another. So I thought that was pretty cool. And another thing too about, in relation to him, of him learning different languages, was discovering, you know, that's one of the best ways to combat racism is through communication. All of a sudden, if we speak the same language, even though you look differently, we can be one and the same because we can exchange ideas and learn from one another, as opposed to if I was speaking in a different language that wasn't one that, you know, wasn't your native tongue, wasn't something that you understood, you would kind of get scared. You would basically just rely on my actions and my tone, and you would kind of use that to base that off of, should I be scared? Should I not be scared? But yet, if we can understand each other, then we're one and the same. Then we can, you know, we can have a debate, we can have a discussion. And, you know, just, you know, learning about different cultures and learning about people's, you know, like this book, which one of the things I like is, it's just like a conversation, which I'm sure that's what he was going for. It's just like if I was sitting here, if I was sitting here face to face talking with him, it would be just like I'm reading the book. And that's what I like about it. Like, I was laughing and, you know, smiling towards listening to some of the stuff. Like, for instance, learning about his uncle, or his grandfather, who had, it turned out he was bipolar, and talking about how, you know, they would be you know, having fun, but then there was other times when he would switch up and get overly aggressive. And he was 80 years old, and he talks about how he would try boxing Trevor, and told him, you know, started dancing around him, like started, you know, corralling him around him, you know, with his fist up, saying, like, you know, let's fight. And, you know, fight, like, put your hands up and fight. And at the time, the kid was like 12 years old or 7 years old, and he didn't know how to react to that. So it just stuff like that. That's kind of, you know, to me, that's what I love about comedy, is because that's what really helps you when you're struggling, is your sense of humor. That's what keeps you going. That's how you can keep going, is when you can, you know, survive those types of situations. And once the situation is over with and you survived it and everything's cool, you can make fun of it. It's much easier to make light of the situation, and when you do that, you know, it helps get rid of the stress and the pain, and because you don't want to hold on to stuff like that. If you hold on to it, you'll be too scared to, you know, do something else. But that was just the first part, and I'm interested to keep on learning more, and you know, bring that knowledge back to you. And I hope that if you haven't read the book, that this encourages you to read it. And if you have read it, that it kind of, you know, it's like a little book discussion. It gives you more meaning out of it. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. All right, see you.